Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Essential NFL Podcast. I'm your host Stephen Clinton, running through the 2026 preview series here. So sorry about the delay in episodes there. I had a few things come up on the family side. All positive stuff. New nephew, welcome to the family, and then parents moving across for their retirement. So all good, glad to help out. But yeah, get to get back on track with all the NFL stuff here, and should be a hard push through June. So yeah, let's get into it. On today's show, I'm going to be talking about, as I label it, three contenders in a rebuild with the Kansas City Chiefs, the Miami Dolphins, the Dallas Cowboys, and the Cincinnati Bengals. So, yeah, I think we'll get right into it here with the Kansas City Chiefs. Oh, and I guess just as a quick note for those of you new to the show, this is a process where I'm just running through all the teams. Post draft, we've got the rosters in place, getting ready for the 2026 NFL season, and building out my model to do fantasy projections, season projections, win totals, all that jazz, and yeah, just getting familiar with the teams as we and then get into a lot more of the coding as the summer goes along here. So yeah, away we go here. So yeah, Kansas City Chiefs, obviously wild to be talking about them this early in a series that's more or less going from order of finish, from last to first, and having Kansas City pop up as high as they did, the fact that they were picking ahead of the Miami Dolphins just really kind of boggles the mind when you think of what those teams have been in the past, and especially what they're going to be moving forward here. So, with Kansas City, obviously, Patrick Mahomes, the knee injury is the huge X factor. Seems like that's going along well. So we'll just, for the purposes of this discussion, assume that's going to go well. So looking at them, moving forward, they've got $7 million in cap space this year. They've got $1 million in cap space next year, and then opens up to $91 million in 2028, which might sound like a lot, but when you compare it to some of the other numbers that we throw around for 2028, it's really not a ton of space. They're pretty committed to this version of the team. They do have all their own or their draft picks from rounds 1 through 5, and then they have an extra pick from the Jets in the 7th round in next year's draft, and then in 2028 they have all their picks. The brain trust in Kansas City more or less in place. Brett Veach remains the GM. Andy Reid is still the head coach and the offensive coordinator. Eric Bieniemy is now holding the offensive coordinator title, but I think it's a real stretch to suggest it's anyone but Andy Reid running that offense, right? So pop over to the defensive side, we got Steve Spagnuolo running the show there, and then special teams coordinator is Dave Toub. So yeah, I think that the Kansas City Chiefs, start with the fact that as long as Patrick Mahomes is out there, this year's record aside, and even considering this year's record, right, they're going to be a competitive team, right? Like, I think that over the past 2 years, you could say that the two teams might have been, more similar than different, but their results were wildly wildly different, despite that. And of course, that was all the one score games they won 2 seasons ago. And then, seemingly, everything going in the opposite direction this way before Mahomes injured his leg and, firmly put them out of contention. It just wasn't their year for any number of reasons. And I think that one thing you need to consider with the Chiefs is certainly the amount of football they have played over the past 3 years. They went to 3 straight Super Bowls. That's an extra month of football for every one of the key contributors on their team, and that eventually is going to add up. So we'll see where it goes. The Chiefs have kind of had 2 versions of this championship team with Patrick Mahomes, with looking back to the Tyreek Hill and peak Travis Kelce era, where they were the most explosive offense in the league, and defense was a contributing factor, but didn't drive success the same way. And then the post Tyreek Hill trade, in the version of the team that has existed since then, which was much more of a defensive heavy team when they drafted Trent McDuffie and then George Karlaftis in the first round. So Kansas City was once again reinventing themselves this offseason. With Mahomes in place, it does have a similar feel to some extent, but they made a huge move in trading Trent McDuffie away for an extra first round pick. And there were so many different ways that Kansas City could have gone with this. And, going into draft weekend, we could have existed in a universe where they had picked, 3 offensive players with their first 3 picks and really tried to turbocharge that offense again around Mahomes and got by with what they have on defense. They decided to take a different course. And, they have already added Kenneth Walker to the fold at running back. So that's going to kind of, get you back to more of this run heavy attack. And it's going to be, running through the defense again where they added all their picks. So, we'll talk about, actually, let's just talk about the defense right now because, that's where they invested all these picks. And of course, not to say that Kansas City used all their resources this offseason on the defense. Of course, brought in Kenneth Walker, but, really, even running through the depth chart now, it's, basically that Justin Fields and then a couple of late round dice rolls, with Emmett Johnson in the 5th round at running backs, Cyrus Allen at wide receiver, and then Garrett Nussmeier to round out the group in the draft. It was, on draft night, it was focused on wide receiver, and that was from the jump when they traded up for Mansour Delane, the corner from LSU, who, for everything that McDuffie brings to the table, I can understand not wanting to pay him at the top of the cornerback market. He's a really he's outstanding in the slot, right? And he's, such an effective blitzer. He's got such great agility side to side. And, his lack of length just doesn't show up quite as much there. And I feel like, as an outside cover guy, comparing him to the Derek Stinleys, the Sauce Gardners, that, sure, leaving names off the list, of course, but you're very elite corners getting paid at the top of the game. Outside of McDuffie, I just feel like all of those guys have more length, and specifically where that shows up is at the catch point down the field. So there's, film that I can think of where McDuffie is in great position. He's in the receiver's hip pocket in a good trail position, and the ball's up and over his head, and he's just unable to get up there and impact the catch point if it's a well thrown ball down the field. And of course, those are moments that are few and far between. But when we're talking about elite players that you're going to pay at the top of the market, I would like it to be a player who doesn't have any deficiencies in his game as at his primary position that you're paying him to play. We'll talk about the Rams and how they'll deploy McDuffie, but all that to say that I can see it from the Chiefs' standpoint. They only had so much cap space. We already talked about, running low for next year. So reloading with a bunch of draft picks and getting to add this much talent is, a very, very defensible approach. And then, there's every possibility that Mansour Delane ends up being a more valuable corner for this defense. If he hits on his potential and he adds that length, then, hey, slot defenders are obviously very valuable in today's game, but there's a lot of different avenues for finding those body types and those types of players. You're truly elite corners. I mean, most of these guys off Pat Surtain would be another one I left off there, but they're typically drafted pretty darn high because it takes just such unique traits to be that player in the NFL. So, they'll have Delane back there. His play is absolutely crucial, I think, in terms of where this defense is going to go. They draft Peter Woods a little bit later in the first round, and it's not quite the same story. But Peter Woods, for those of you who don't know, was seen as maybe the number one prospect coming into the year by a number of different draft analysts, and he just did not have as impactful a season on the Clemson defense, which the Clemson team was disappointing across the board. For those of you who don't follow college football, the guy I'd point to though on the Chiefs who has bucked that profile is Creed Humphrey, who was, outstanding as a freshman at Oklahoma. And then, you could ask him, but apparently the analyst said the next 2 years of college ball were not as dominant. He goes in the second round, ironically, right after Josh Myers, if memory serves, and he's been arguably the best center in the league since he got on the field, right? And not to say there's not other names in that group, but Creed Humphrey's been outstanding from the get-go and just continues to be outstanding for them. So hey, Peter Woods could show up, be that guy. They draft R. Mason Thomas in the second round with their third pick in the draft, and he's going to bring speed rush off the edge, and a best case scenario that people are throwing out is, hey, you get D Ford back and get that kind of element added in, which is really would be a great complement to what George Karlaftis brings to the table. On the other side is a more physical rusher who's winning more with his hands and with getting off the offensive tackle and being narrow, and he's not the most explosive guy in the world, right, in Karlaftis. So I think that in theory R. Mason Thomas could be a really great complement to him. And then on top of that, they add Jaden Kennedy in the fourth round. And hey, all the pre-draft talk on the Chiefs was about how, hey, this team probably waits till the later rounds to get their corners going different spot at the top of the draft. Of course, they buck convention there, but doesn't negate the fact that they're really good at developing these guys that they get later in the draft. So you've got him in the mix. You got Noah Williams, who had some good moments last year. As a third round pick, I feel like he's plays a little bit slight, maybe not that physical. I think that he's definitely not certainly a player you want on your roster and somebody who can contribute out there, but I'd like to see him, amp up the physicality a little bit more. And I think that he could really, be a very solid starting corner if that comes together. And then you bring in Alohi Gilman to play safety, and that'll be one of the bigger change. Quite a few changes on this defense, but bringing Gilman in and letting Justin, after Justin Reed departed, I guess a couple of years ago now, kind of gets you back to having that veteran presence at safety. Brian Cook obviously was an in-house development, rather than a free agent acquisition, and kind of filled that veteran role last year. But, whether it was Tyrann Mathieu, whether it was Justin Reed, or whether it was Alohi Gilman, we'll see on Gilman, but the Chiefs have done a good job of identifying safeties who will be a good fit in Spagnuolo's defense. So I think there's a good chance that he plays well there, and we'll kind of see what happens with Chamari Connor here. I've always liked Chamari Connor as like a physical player who fits down there in the box, but he's just not a strong cover player. So having him in the slot has had its real limitations. So we'll kind of see how he fits in, playing from deep safety, and whether they're able to deploy him in a way where offensive coordinators aren't able to get him isolated in coverage and take advantage of those same coverage issues that we saw in the slot, because that'll be a big question mark. But at the end of the day, they've it's still going to run through Chris Jones, right? Who, at his best moments, Chris Jones is still elite player. Whether or not he played at that consistently elite level on as high a percentage of the snaps as he used to last season, I think that's, up for debate. He would be one of the top guys on that list of people who would racked up a ton of snaps. And, defensive tackle is certainly, there's only so many guys who really play that, 100% all the time. And even then, I think you need to be selective about how you're using your energy. If you're not playing smart out there, then, it's just going to be very difficult to hold up, snap in and snap out, right? So I think that maybe, Chris Jones gets refreshed, getting a little older in his career here, and comes back, but he's got all the tools to continue to be very impactful player for them. And then, Nick Bolton, not the rangiest linebacker, but certainly a very good run player in the box. And then you still got Drew Tranquil. So I think that this defense, it could wind up being a really, really good group. Now, of course, the danger here is that, if these draft picks don't hit, and all we're really talking about is that, well, Kairos Tonga is a good run stuffer for us, and then, Alohi Gilman's playing well at safety, which I feel more confident about those things. And I guess, throw in Kader K, who's a competent player in the slot, but I don't think that's a needle moving move. If this draft class doesn't work out, then we got a whole different discussion, and we're really kind of back to where the Chiefs were last year, where they kind of lacked the pass rush juice and to really generate pressure without blitzing, and then they didn't have the coverage to really hold up on the back end when they did that. So, it's a lot to come together. Obviously you hope for the best, but at the same time, Felix, FAU, I don't know how to pronounce that last name. And, you were hoping he was going to be the speed rusher when they drafted him with, first round pick back in 2023. Doesn't always work out. So, is Arm Mason Thomas, going to come back in, replicate kind of what D Ford brought to the table in Kansas City, or is he, another FAU? And, only time will tell on that. But you can see that, the defense, I think, could certainly get back to being a top 10 defense as they were during those Super Bowl runs. And, how the offense complements them, I think that's going to be an interesting thing here, right? So I think Kenneth Walker as an addition as the running back is, great piece to add. The one thing I would say is that, that right now the depth chart behind him's Amari DiMercado, who's, really just a third down back, kind of scat back from Arizona. And then you've got Emmett Johnson, who you drafted in the 5th round. Now, I guess you could bring Kareem Hunt back again, but Pacheco has signed with Detroit. And Kenneth Walker, the big question coming into this year was not so much about, or at least in my mind, was not so much about how explosive he was or what a talented player he was. It was more about whether he would be able to stay healthy if he was taking a full workload. And obviously he did that down the stretch, getting the Super Bowl, but he and Zach Charbonnet split touches throughout the season. So how does that work out if Kenneth Walker is going to be asked to carry more of a load? I think that the strength of this offense really needs to be the offensive line. I think that, from left tackle to right guard, they have a chance to be really, really good. I mean, Josh Simmons' tape while he was out there was really promising last year. He's just got great strength for a guy at that size with his feet, his movement skills are just top notch. And then the jolt he gets on guys when you see him get out there. I mean, he's just a very explosive athlete and, really a steal for them, of course, if he can be more available, and not to whatever was going on in his life was going on in his life, but it's the NFL, and you need to be on the field to produce results. So that hopefully he's out there for him. Kingsley Suamataia, I think that he could wind up being a pretty dang good guard here. As the season went on, I thought certainly wasn't a glaring weakness out there, in my opinion. And with his size, he can just, displace guys. And I think as he gets more used to playing inside after playing tackle his rookie year, I wouldn't say necessarily the sky is the limit for Suamataia, but I think that he can, definitely be a plus player for them along that line. And then, Creed Humphrey, who I mentioned earlier, remains in place as just a stud at the pivot spot. And if Trey Smith is back and healthy next to him, then that is just a group, especially on the interior, that it would have a very different feel than when Joe Thuney, Joe Thuney is just, model of consistency and everything like that at guard. Very different player than Suamataia, who's just a bigger dude, right? Actually has the frame to play tackle that Thuney lacks, which is why Thuney only kicks out to tackle on occasion. I think they could be just great. And then Jalen Moore can be a very steady player for them at right tackle. They paid Jawan Taylor a lot of money to come over in free agency, but I don't think he ever played better than average. And that might be a little bit generous during his contract with Kansas City. And it's an unfortunate thing if they never sign that deal. Maybe they've got the money to keep Thuney in, roads that you could have gone down, right? But they should be in a good place on the O-line. And I think Jalen Moore could perform just as well as Jawan Taylor has over his stint in Kansas City. And the Chiefs won a lot of Super Bowls with him, with that setup. So at receiver, it just continues to be kind of chaos, right? Now Rashee Rice is currently in jail while I'm recording this podcast, which is glad take a moment to be glad to be here. Not that that's gonna be the end of the world for him, but it's obviously not like ideal for off-season training. And Rice is not exactly the most refined receiver, I wouldn't say. I'd say he's definitely a plus player to have out there and somebody you want. But when I kind of think of Rashee Rice's highlight reel in my head, I just think of so many quick hitters and then just really strong run after catch ability and all that. But it's not like I think of him running like a lot of well-developed routes and a lot of intermediate deep, just not mixing it up in the way that like I think of a Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase when those guys come on, and like just so much more variety, I guess, at least in my personal highlight reel of these guys. And so you'd love to see him developing his game. I kind of doubt that's going to happen. I think he kind of is what he is. And, as a result, you might still be seeing, some deep shots go into Tyquan Thornton like we saw last year, which doesn't seem like the most ideal situation. We'll see what happens with Xavier Worthy. Obviously gets derailed by the injury early last year. The tough thing with Worthy, though, is that he's always going to have struggles in the run game because he's just so small that he's just going to, get displaced by defenders. So, he's such a specialty player, and hopefully they can get more explosive plays out of him. Because if they're not getting that from him, it's just kind of hard to see this all coming together. I mean, honestly, as I'm talking this out, like if Xavier Worthy doesn't work out for them and they don't trade for, another weapon, I just think that you're going to have another Kansas City offense that's pretty limited and really just asking Mahomes to limit mistakes and be methodical with the way he's playing and everything like that. And they'll be more explosive if they've got, Kenneth Walker out there. But again, how long does that last? And I guess the last thought on the offense and to round it out on the Chiefs is, yes, Travis Kelce is on the roster. Yeah, I just don't feel like you're getting a ton from him relative to X tight end that you sign off the street these days. And obviously, all-time player, elite guy, blue chip in my book for 5-6 years. I would have went so far as to say, for several years there, that like if you want like the best bet to just be the top finisher at his position in fantasy football, just get Travis Kelce, right? He's going to go for, 100 catches. He's going to go for 100 yards. He's going to score 10 touchdowns. I mean, it was like clockwork year after year. And, not to say that was the best strategy to actually use, but, running backs and wide receivers, we see volatility typically year after year and guys cycling out, and it's hard to peg who's going to be the leader. I mean, Kelce was that dude for forever. So no knock on his career, but, there's a reason that, Rob Gronkowski and, Shannon Sharp aren't playing in the league anymore, right? Age catches up to everyone. And Kelsey's gotten up there. So, I think they're very, very average in the tight, or probably below average in the tight end room. And, I have a lot of confidence in these receivers. So we'll see what happens with Kansas City. But, I don't necessarily see them just automatically rebounding to title contention because the league has gotten, the division's gotten tougher around them. The conference is pretty deep right now, and you just don't see like a dominant roster here. So we'll see. Patrick Mahomes obviously has the ability to prove us wrong there, and well-established brain trust. But I think it's going to be a really interesting season ahead for Kansas City, and certainly shouldn't take it for granted that they're just going to start ringing off Super Bowls again, right? Like Patriots had a long gap between the first Super Bowls and the last Super Bowls, and it's anything's possible for the Chiefs here, I think. So we'll see. At the very least, I think they'll be competitive. They're going to be a tough out, just like they were last year. But yeah, it's not as if they reshuffled things. They got younger, cleared salary, but it's not as if they got overwhelmingly better, I would not say. So moving on to teams that certainly look like they're going to be a lot worse. The Miami Dolphins, this situation that the new GM, John Eric Sullivan, and the new head coach, Jeff Hafley, who both come over from the Packers, along with the quarterback they signed, Malik Willis. This is about as bad a situation as you can inherit. They have, so much in dead cap money. They're carrying 180 million in dead cap money for this year, and they'll still be carrying 57 million in dead cap next year. They do have, they've only got 2 million left in cap space this year. That was without Devon Achane's deal, so I'm not sure exactly how that'll filter into these numbers. But and then 2027, 143 million in cap space. Even with all that dead cap, but that just speaks. Which is what we'll get to, just the lack of talent here. And then in 2028, they're projected to have 412 million, which, that's basically the whole salary cap, right? And, as it projects to rise, which, that's just the overarching point of, man, the cap just keeps going up and up, right? So, setting the cap discussion aside, this is just such a difficult situation to overcome in Miami because, at the end of the day, there's just not really much talent on this roster at all. And you can kind of look across the board and just point to so many position groups that are deficient. So, we'll talk about, I'll just go offense, defense with Miami, and there's only so much to talk about. I think that Patrick Paul is, a good player at left tackle, or an ascending player who's potentially a longer term piece. We'll see what they get out of Jonah Savaina, the guard they drafted in the second round last year. He was fine. I don't think he was dominant or anything special. And then Aaron Brewer is a pretty specific type of player. And while I think he is, if you, I was not high on Aaron Brewer early in his time in Miami just because he was so deficient at the point of attack, but they did, I think, figure out how to weaponize him. Part of that's Mike McDaniel, though, right? So, how effective is Aaron Brewer as an undersized center in the new scheme that Bobby Slowick is going to be coming in and installing? And yeah, Slowick has shared roots with McDaniel in the Shanahan system, but I don't think that he's shown himself to be nearly as creative as Mike McDaniel is. So we'll kind of see how that works out. Austin Jackson's out there at right tackle as, a homegrown player, but, not a particularly impactful one, just kind of a solid right tackle. And, now, we'll talk about the draft picks they added, but, that's the big positive for the offense in my estimation is the offensive line. And I'm not talking about it in glowing terms. Now, they add Caden Proctor in the first round, huge prospect out of Alabama. We'll see how he works out. He's going to be starting at left guard for them, and kind of see. But that's a big man, and there were mixed opinions on him. And Miami seemed like maybe it wasn't the ideal city for a player with some of the concerns with Proctor to be headed to. So obviously wish the best for the dude and hope he's a super fun player to watch. But there's no guarantee there. And then, you might be able to scheme up a dynamic running game here. We still have Achane there. You still have Jalen Wright and, Ollie Gordon, who have shown they can, chip in as well. And then Malik Willis is obviously a dynamic athlete at quarterback. But, this wide receiver group, unless the different young players that they drafted went out, and we can extend this to tight end, they just don't have good players here. Like Greg Dulcich is the one veteran tight end with any sort of experience. And, we saw the way he bounced around the league after he was cut from Denver. He only brings stuff as a receiver, and he's, only so explosive when it comes to that. And then the receiver room right now is Jalen Tolbert, who's, fine player to have on your roster as your 3, but, seems like he's clearly the best receiver, I guess the most accomplished receiver for Miami right now. Tutu Atwell and Malik Washington, who are both, 5'8", at least Washington's thick. Atwell's like 160 pounds, and you're sitting in a situation where Jalen Tolbert's your biggest receiver at 6'1", 200. So you don't have some of the good stuff with McDaniel with his creativity left over, but you've got like this tiny receiver room that he brought together. So we'll see. They drafted like a glut of skill players in the third round and fifth round. You got three players in tight end Will Kazmarek, or Kaczmarek, I guess. Wide receiver Chris Bell and wide receiver Caleb Douglas in the third round, and then you've got guys like Kevin Coleman they drafted in the fifth round, Sadoy Traore, and if you're watching the video, I'm just reading these names off the search. I don't know the mid round draft picks in and out at this point. So maybe one of those guys hits, but it's not that likely that you're going to have like multiple contributors out of despite the fact that you've got bulk shopping there. I think that you got a situation where the offense could just be really stagnant. I don't know if that's going to be great for the development of some of their alignment if the whole operation is just not working. I think that the thing that's tougher, and this is less true on the offense. I wish that they'd come in here and had more of an identity that they were putting on this team, because going back to the point about them being able to run the ball with the quarterback they have in place and the running backs, well, now we got three wide receivers who are slated to start as veterans who are not going to be super effective blockers because they're just not big enough, right? And so then you get Caden Proctor, who's, would profile as like a power, downhill blocker. But again, unless you get, these rookie tight ends online, you didn't, add a veteran presence as a blocker at tight end. I don't think you would say a strong one. So, and not that they had money to throw around or anything like that, but, it's not as, I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's not as if they brought in Malik Willis and then got a coordinator who has a background working with running quarterbacks and, has been really creative in the past. They got a coordinator who was kind of static in what he did and what he brought over and just continued to run. And then you don't like complement the receiver and the running back with or the quarterback and the running back with tight ends and receivers who you would expect to be good blockers. And again, that's barring what the rookie class does, but it's just not, huge draft capital. So like, we'll see what it comes together as, but as much fun as I had watching Malik Willis play quarterback for the Packers over the past couple of years, and as much as he's developed, I struggle to see this working very well down there in Miami, and especially given the fact that I don't think they're going to be playing with the lead very often. Which would be ideal as a running offense, because I think that this defense is going to be giving up a lot of points in the year to come. And this is where I am really kind of underwhelmed with some of the stuff that's going on with this whole setup here. So obviously Jeff Hafley has his vision as a defensive coordinator and everything like that, but the fact that you've got Chop Robinson in place as your edge rusher, right? Who's kind of the established player on the roster, former first round pick, and he's I like Chop's best tape a lot, and he's a really explosive player, but he's just not very big, right? He's not a big physical presence, and and especially in a league that's shifting more and more towards the run, especially in a division where the Patriots and the Bills, I think we could say, emphasize that as your main competition. Chop's not going to be a standout there, and so they went out and signed Josh Uche and David Ojabo, and I know that you can't just have your pick of the litter as the Dolphins, but neither one of those guys profiles as like a physical defender against the run on the edge. So, I really like Zach Seiler on the inside at defensive tackle. I think he's been a very good player for them. Obviously, the Dolphins do too, given the extension that they gave to him. But I think you'd say Kenneth Grant was a disappointment as a first-round pick, so who knows if they've got much there. And then, in terms of where they spent some of their premium draft capital, the middle linebacker or the off-ball linebacker position, is in pretty good shape, I'd say, with Tyrell Dodson as a solid enough player. And then Jordan Brooks is a standout player who's got really, really good range, obviously former first round pick. And, they draft Jacob Rodriguez in the second round and then Kyle Lewis in the fourth, with Rodriguez being the higher regarded prospect. He was a guy who was brought up as having great play recognition, great play instincts. So, maybe it's just a situation where you're going to be trading Jordan Brooks in 5 weeks anyway. And, he gets to give, Jacob Rodriguez a chance to learn from Jordan Brooks for training camp and then into the season before you make that move. Don't thrust the rookie into the situation. But again, it was just kind of a move where it's just feels a little like, they're just waving the flag to not be competitive. And, at the same time, like, they're not going to be competitive here, but I just don't really get what the identity of this team is going to be unless it's, sticking to the undersized receivers and now undersized edge rushers themes, right? Like, those are kind of things that stick out. I guess you could say, they only added Proctor on the O-line, so I can't even say there's a trend towards getting really big there. So we'll see. The last player who will be exciting to watch on this defense is Chris Johnson, the first round pick, who is going to be thrust into kind of a difficult situation here where, we were just talking about Mansour Delane and, what he could bring to Kansas City and the expectations. And, that I guess left unsaid is they really need him to excel as the number one corner to get back to where they were on defense. Chris Johnson could excel as the number one corner and they're going to be terrible on defense anyway. And he has a nobody around him. I mean, the expectation for both these guys is probably that you're the best player in our secondary, but like the bar that Delane would have to clear for that, like versus the bar that, Chris Johnson will be asked to clear here. I mean, it's pretty staggering. You're looking at, I'm looking at our lads for the depth chart right now. I mean, you're talking guys like, Juju Brents, who, was in Indy, did not work out there at all. Perhaps Darrell Baker as the other outside cornerback. I mean, Marco Wilson, who's kind of been around the league as a journeyman, is, he might wind up getting snaps. Lonnie Johnson and Dante Trader as your safeties. I mean, there's just nothing inspiring with the personnel here. And so, I think overall this is a scenario where everybody is really likely to get fired in 2 years, like, just to be blunt about it. And that's a bummer. And I guess, you get good contracts signed with these head coaching and GM jobs. And, the GM might have a little more latitude. But, for Hafley, who's a defensive guy, he's going to come in here. This defense could be the worst defense in the league. And no matter what the explanation or justification for that is, that's going to look really bad. It's not going to play well in the media. The offense, I don't see how they're, going to be kind of anything better than sort of a novelty, I guess I'd almost say. Like, even thinking back to like looking at that Jets offense they were trying to put together around Justin Fields, at least there were a few pieces where Garrett Wilson was a proven guy and, Breece Hall at running back, probably a more promising offensive line, all things considered. And I mean, that was a total debacle too. And, not great, not the right coordinator, I don't think, for something that difficult to pull off. But yeah, I don't know. I'll see, like, I think it's going to be tough. And then, Slowick on offense. I mean, maybe he's reinvented himself, but I don't see him as the guy who's like just about to unlock Malik Willis. So, if it plays out that way, we'll see if the Dolphins can identify a few core players here. But if you're losing games, it's tough to keep your job. And, could be a situation where, hopefully they can stockpile some talent over the next few years. But I mean, this could be a squad that's heading into 2028 that's still just kind of lost in the wilderness here. And you hate to say it from Malik Willis because you want to say maybe, if Willis can do this, that, or the other and wind up being their franchise quarterback. And I guess that's true, but like it feels like it would take dang near a miracle for anybody to win with this roster. I would not be optimistic about Miami's chances to win the AFC East. I guess I'd say if you swap Josh Allen for Malik Willis, I wouldn't be optimistic that Josh Allen would be able to win the division with this team. I think that you'd probably wind up and, haven't gotten into New England and Buffalo in this series, and this is just kind of off the top of my head, but I think you'd probably take both those teams. Obviously, the Patriots would be the favorite, and I think that I take Willis and what the Bills have in place with that run game and some of their receivers. I guess that kind of sounds silly with some of the concerns, but like that, even compared to this, I mean, there's some established players now in Buffalo, despite all the hand bringing up there. So we'll see. It is what it is in Miami. They're essentially, they tanked for Tua, went through the Tua era. Overspent wildly, came nowhere close to winning a Super Bowl, and now they're left with this. And yeah, it's just going to be a difficult deal to try to win over the next couple of years with this total lack of resources. So, best of luck to the fellas down in Green Bay or in Miami. Like I said, I enjoyed all the work those guys, obviously the GM pretty behind the scenes, but I enjoyed the work Halfley did as the defensive coordinator with the Packers. Enjoyed watching Malik Willis play quarterback for them, but man, they have gone down into a much more difficult environment to have success in. I think it's fair to say. So, all right. Well, moving on from that depressing discussion, we're going to talk about two teams here that I think are pretty darn similar in a lot of ways entering the season. And that's the Cincinnati Bengals and the Dallas Cowboys. And I don't think that the reason for this comparison is too difficult to guess at. I think you've got two pretty clear top 10 offenses that are, are run by, top 10 quarterbacks and an elite pair of wide receivers. In the case of the Dallas Cowboys, they've got, two arguably top 10, top 5 receivers in CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens. And then, in Cincinnati, you've got arguably the best in the league in Jamar Chase, and then T. Higgins, who, he might not quite be in that top 10 discussion, but he'd be the number one receiver on plenty of teams in the NFL. So, I mean, it's a heck of a group. And then obviously we all know who Dak Prescott and Joe Burrow are, right? So I think that, we'll get into the specifics here for the Bengals, but yeah, you've got kind of these two teams that the defense has not been there the last couple of years, obviously have fallen short of their goals and, have made different changes on both sides as a result of that. And I think that you're going into the season with overhauled defenses and, largely the same groups on offense with the hope that, hey, if it all comes together, every reason to think that we can compete. And I think that's pretty fair for these teams. So let's dive into Cincinnati specifically. So the Bengals have $8 million in cap space this year. They've got $35 million in cap space next year, and then $138 in 2028. They've got all their picks in 2027, all their picks in 2028. Missed that with Miami. I actually don't have that on the sheet, but hey, I can look that up real quick. Actually, I'll just keep going with the Bengals. I'll get the Dolphins thrown into the show notes. Not that important. I assume they have most, if not, extra picks, right? So it doesn't really matter though, because they need to build some infrastructure. I mean, obviously those picks will help, but first thing is to get some solid players on that roster. But back to the Bengals, so they have their picks in rounds 1 through 7 in each of the next 2 years, which is a very Cincinnati thing to do, unlike the trade for Dexter Lawrence that we saw. Duke Tobin is still in place as the de facto GM. Owner Mike Brown is kind of very involved as well. Head coach is Zach Taylor. Offensive coordinator is Dan Pitcher. Zach Taylor's offensive guy. So Al Golden is the defensive coordinator, and then Darren Simmons is the special teams coordinator. So looking at this crew, I think that it's a big picture observation I'll start with. I think that Cincinnati probably has 2 years here for these players. Obviously, if they're successful, it'll be longer. But I think that, if you look at the way Lawrence's contract was signed, he got 1 year extension. Bengals don't do signing bonuses most of the time, so they can cut him with no dead cap money. So, but probably committed to him for at least 2 years after the trade for him. And similar things could be said just about kind of the core with group with T. Higgins. Do you still keep building the offense with those receivers? So we'll see. But with that being said, I think that if it is that 2-year runway for the players, it's probably 1 year for the coaching staff. And if they can't get it right this year, then probably the big change next offseason is to overhaul the coaching staff entirely. Of course, Al Golden took over for Lou Anarumo on defense to mixed, if not bad results last year. But so the next change is likely to be the head coach, and Cincinnati's organizational structure, like the people at the top, are unlikely to change. So that would be the big lever that they pull next offseason if this doesn't all work out. In terms of whether or not it could work out, I guess we'll start with the part that's easier. The offense definitely could work out, right? I just mentioned the core players in Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. They are outstanding players. Chase, as I said, arguably the best receiver in the game. Burrow is elite when he's at his best. And and they play with a very good running back in Chase Brown, who brings plenty to the table. Samaje P. Ryan remains on the roster as a third down back, who's a very good blocker, capable receiver, all that stuff. Have Mike Gesicki to roll into the mix as a pass catching tight end. You got Drew Sample, more traditional at tight end. Andre Yosevas, who can mix it in there as their third receiver. So plenty of weapons. And then offensive line isn't as star-studded, but Amarius Mims, the right tackle, is toolsy as all get out. I mean, just an unbelievably smooth mover at his size. And we'll see what his career develops into. I don't think he quite hit the point where people were talking about him. I mean, as the best right tackle in the league, which I think that he's got the physical skill set to do. So we'll see how he develops this year. But still really high on Mims. I mean, he's just such an easy mover at incredible size out there. Rest of the line is, I think more average at best. Orlando Brown, if I'm not mistaken, his contract number was $16 million a year when he re-signed this offseason. That's less than Dan Moore makes. So I think there's kind of a mutual understanding there that, Orlando Brown, you'd probably call him an adequate left tackle, but he's not, about to compete for all pro honors, I don't think, or his contract really doesn't reflect that. On the interior, Dalton Reisner is, penciled in as the starter, which, man, after, it's so strange after, he had injuries as he left Denver, but he started so many games on that rookie deal and then just, would wind up starting a bunch of games for Minnesota and then, winds up in in Cincinnati, but just took so long to kind of solidify himself in somewhere, but he slotted in as the right guard there. And then you have veteran Ted Karras at center, and then at left guard you got Dylan Fairchild. So again, I think that group's more average than anything. Karras is fine at center. I don't think that he's like a big difference maker there. And then at left guard, I think Fairchild is, he's solid, but I don't see it like a ton of room for upside there just based on the physical traits, physical package, anything like that. I think he'll be solid, competent there, but like I'd be closer to saying like, you probably would have said a lot of things like that about Cordell Volson after he got his spot in the starting lineup for the Bengals, and he wound up kind of playing his way out of favor there and is no longer on the roster. So, Fairchild, it obviously could go very differently for him, but like, I guess I could see either one of those pass, and or I could see him being, improving to some degree, having maybe a career like Dalton Reisner's where he's just a steady enough player at guard and you can start with him, but I don't see him being overwhelming. So, maybe he proves me wrong and, that would be a huge boost to the interior of the Cincinnati line, but I think that that's more just okay than anything. So it's kind of a boring thing to talk about during the offseason almost because it's got such a long track record of proof of concept of when Burrow, when Chase, when Higgins are all out there, how this thing can hum. So hopefully they're healthy and, get to put their best foot forward. So the defense is obviously where things were problematic the past few years and where they get dicey when we start talking about the offseason moves. So in terms of talking about the Dexter Lawrence trade, I think it's actually pretty straightforward. If I knew that I was getting the Dexter Lawrence that we saw in 2023 and 2024, I'd make this deal, every day of the week. Dexter Lawrence at his peak is physically overwhelming in a way that you very rarely see on NFL tape. There was a stretch where, he was just forklifting, especially centers, but interior offensive linemen and just, driving them back to the quarterback like they are high schoolers. And I was listening to a podcast at one point where defensive end Carl Lawson, who was on the Jets back when Lawrence's dominant stretch with the Giants, he was talking about the game where Lawrence injured two of their centers, just physically overwhelming them again. So, the numbers, it's not like he was a 20 sack guy or anything even at his peak, but he's just such an impactful player in the middle of the line, and it's just constantly collapsing the pocket and in the quarterback's face, driving linemen back. He was just, a marvel to watch at his peak and a huge problem. So if the Bengals get that guy, then, this defense could really come together around him. I think there's a lot of interesting pieces we'll get to, but the Dexter Lawrence that, I saw when I watched the film last year was just not as fun to watch. I didn't feel like I was watching Sexy Dexy from 2023 and 2024. It was just, just kind of a bummer. Like, it's not like he was terrible out there by any means, but he just wasn't affecting the game the same way he did. He wasn't overwhelming dudes the same way he had. And, obviously was coming off the elbow injury. Who knows what contributed to that, but it wasn't the player that you wanted to see. So, we'll see what happens there. But if they get that version of Dexter Lawrence that played in 2025, I think that this is going to be a pretty disappointing trade. because yeah, you're not trading the 10th overall pick as especially for a team in this position and hoping for average or call it above average, just kind of hold your point nose tackle play. Like you want that dominant player that has been out there on the NFL field. So we'll see what happens there, but certainly no guarantees. We're going to talk about the Cowboys in a minute, and the defensive tackle they swung their big trade for in Quinnen Williams from the New York Jets. Quentin Williams has just been, so much more consistently impactful year after year after year in the league. Like you could talk about maybe his ascension arc, but since he became, an elite player, I feel like Quentin Williams has been an elite player when he's been on the field. With Lawrence, it was, a slower climb to become the elite player, and then, a peak and definitely a downward, you know, he did not jump off the screen the same way last year. So we'll see what happens there. Around him, it's a lot of again of just like bets, right? In Cincinnati, I mean Jonathan Allen, if he was pairing up next to Dexter Lawrence a few years back, I mean Jonathan Allen was a really really strong three technique, like borderline. I would say he was elite on his best days and a plus player overall when he was playing in Washington next to Daron Payne, and capable of overwhelming guys one on one. Very slippery as an inside pass rusher. I don't think that you're getting that guy anymore. Yeah, he's just not impacting the game on an as consistent a basis. Now, if Lawrence is his best self, then it could certainly set things up really well for Allen to go to work, because Lawrence is going to be commanding double teams, and then if Allen's just one on one consistently with a guard, maybe we see a big bounce back year from him. And then on the edges, we'll see Boy Mafe comes in. He's making good money as an edge. He's a very steady player. It's not like he was a standout on Seattle's defense last year, though, right? He was part of the whole and a positive contributor, but he doesn't have the potential, I think, to come in and change this unit the way Lawrence does, right? He has the potential to come in and provide a steadying force on the edge with some question marks behind him, but it's just not what I'm expecting to be the big difference maker for this group. Now, the rest of the edge room, you've got Miles Murphy, who's coming back for the last year of his rookie deal, former first round pick, could still grow, still coming along as a player, didn't have his fifth year option picked up, but like played well enough, I guess, in the back half of his third year that he made it a discussion where it would have been a total non-discussion after 2 years. So we'll see what happens with him. And then they've got two other young guys in Shamar Stewart, last year's first-round draft pick, and Cassius Howell, this year's second-round draft pick, who have the potential to add some juice off the edge with a group that, not only lost Trey Hendrickson, who finally left after that, just debacle of a situation for the last, I guess, 3 years. But, just some familiar faces like Joseph Asai, who I feel like he's been playing for the Bengals for a long time. Maybe it was only his rookie deal, but it feels like it was longer than that, like 5-6 years. Just, a few familiar faces there. It's not the end of the world to move on from these guys, of course, but like just a little bit of a different feel there with the guys that they will have this year. So, they've got some depth at defensive tackle with BJ Hill and TJ Sladen. I think that's a good, second line rotation. But the questions remain, are we going to get impact play out of that, Lawrence Allen duo in the middle? And then, what the heck are we going to get out of the edge rush group outside of Boy Mafe, who we're really just expecting to be like a steady player for us. In terms of the expectations for the linebacker room, I don't know why anybody would expect Demetrius Knight and Barrett Carter to be anything better than below average next year, and that would be a huge improvement for the two of them. It's just a rough situation. I don't think that either of them have like stand out as having like elite traits where if they were recognizing things, even on a average level, there would be like something really big to unlock. I think they'd be fine if they did have good recognition skills, but they don't. And it's not like there's like this otherworldly potential to unlock there, or some like super rangy, like potential Fred Warner there. If that makes sense. And, their play identification last year was just atrocious. And, the ability to manipulate that linebacker pair with whether it was with play action, whether it was just with like, getting them matched up and having them try to cover routes, even when they did figure out, or were covering the right guy at the right time. It was just bad. And, I don't know that you need, I think that you do need good middle of the field play to be an elite defense. I don't know if you need, great inside linebacker to play to be an average defense, which is probably what Cincinnati is hoping for. But I just don't know how you're going to be effective as a group when you're that bad at the second level. So we'll see if they make an addition or swing a trade for somebody else. But I think that that's a really problematic pairing, or it was last year. And I'm just not sure, why anybody would be like really, really optimistic that that's just going to turn itself around, right? Same coaching staff, same players. And again, these are not players who were like, who have pop off the tape traits. So we'll see where it goes. Like, obviously, hey, Zach Bond surprised the hell out of everybody a couple of years ago for the Eagles, right? Of course, position switch involved there. Let's try not to complicate the effort to be optimistic for these two players going into their second year. But and obviously the best two of them, and if they find a way to improve, that'd be outstanding for them and make this defense a lot more fun to watch. But I'm just not holding my breath for it. The back end, we'll see what happens here. DJ Turner, I think, showed he's a pretty good player last year. In again a difficult situation, I think Turner showed he can be capable of covering guys. You can at least, I think, confidently pencil him in as a starter. And then they added, Brian Cook in free agency. Whether he's like the most dynamic difference maker, I think that's debatable, but he's a very solid tackler and at least should bring a steadying presence to this group that just like, you know, has been rough. But at the same time, he might be dealing with a lot more difficult angles and a lot less structure than he had in Steve Spagnuolo's defense, particularly if he's trying to tackle guys who are running clear up the middle of the field to him because the linebackers are completely out of position. Well, the degree of difficulty on the tackle goes up for these guys at some point too, not to totally hand wave away all the problems the Bengals have tackling at the second level last year, but like it's just compounding errors, right? And guys, and guys not playing together, guys not, playing inside out leverage on guys to, all the things that make it harder to make missed tackles work. And, we'll see if, Jordan Battle is, continues to ascend. He's still not a player I think that I'd have complete confidence in. You bring in Kyle Duggar, who's been more of a, defined role player, I guess you could say, moving on to Pittsburgh last year, but I think can definitely, play into a role. But, this has also just been a group where guys have struggled to fit in, where like, Geno Stone, they were optimistic about bringing over from the Ravens coming off, granted a season where he had a lot of interceptions that were, more on the quarterback and how the play played out than anything Geno Stone did. But setting that aside, he got, I think, a lot worse in Cincinnati, and we'll see. It's just a lot of guys still left on the step chart. Whether maybe Dax Hill takes another step this year. But are you going to get more out of Jalen Davis or Josh Newton? I don't really, think there's a lot of reason to think that. And then maybe Tacario Davis, the third round pick, maybe he adds to the back end of this defense. But I don't know. It's a tough deal because I think that all of this is very volatile, right? I think that the number of players that you think can be like really true standouts, like, so much of this, I think, hinges on, Dexter Lawrence being a stud for you. And then, I think Brian Cook being like a real steadying presence on that back end. And hopefully DJ Turner taking another step and becoming like a premier player. Obviously, there's it's the NFL. It could play out a lot of different ways than that. But I just don't see, if those things don't happen, how this defense is really going to be impactful at all. And I can definitely see a situation where, like, I mean, there's a possibility that really none of this works. Like, Brian Cook might not be the same player out of the structure of Spagnuolo's defense. If Lawrence plays like he did last year, that's a problem right out of the gate. And, whether or not Jonathan Allen just might not have much left in the tank. So, if you're left with Boy Mafe, trying to impact games as kind of the one guy out there, and Brian Cook trying to hold it down on the back end behind two bad linebackers, you might get pretty similar results. And Shamar Stewart, Cassius Howell, like who knows? I mean, Shamar Stewart did not impact things last year, and Cassius Howell, apparently, really impactful speed rusher, but has very short arms, some different things with his profile that caused him to drop. So, range of outcomes on all this stuff, and we'll see how it works out. I think that for the Bengals, it's still reasonable to think that they could potentially get into the dance and make a push for the Super Bowl just because the offense can be so talented and overwhelm teams. And as long as the defense is, if that defensive line does come together and they can at least create pressure and, create turnovers and create some havoc, maybe trade for a linebacker. We talked about Jordan Brooks earlier. Maybe they bring it together. And I don't think that there's some juggernaut waiting there in the AFC. So I think they could make it through. But at the same time, even with everything they've done on this defense, I just feel very lukewarm as I look at that depth chart. And like even more so, I wrote this up and have the article up. Did that earlier today, and looking at it second, I just feel more of the same. So we'll see. Some more tape to consume, and I'm always looking at my opinions change on this stuff, right? Because if I'm holding some crazy opinion, that ain't helping me project numbers or win bets very well. But yeah, it's just we'll see. I just don't get too jazzed up looking at that. Things I do get kind of jazzed up looking at. I'm pretty excited about what this Dallas Cowboys team is going to look like. And yeah, that has not always been the case in my time watching film or observing the Cowboys. I've had, units of theirs that I absolutely love. But in terms of the entire whole as a roster, it's always felt like there's just something that's going to fall apart here. Or, they're going to always be competitive, but like the other shoe's just going to drop when it comes to contending. And, who knows? I as I look at this, I feel like, if there's a Dallas team that's going to do it that I've looked at over the past decade, I think it's this one. I think that it's an offense that it should be outstanding again. You bring back George Pickens and CeeDee Lamb. I think that the coaching staff and as it said, Brian Schottenheimer and his coaching staff did a really nice job last offseason. And now, Matt Eberflus was there as the defensive coordinator, as kind of that veteran presence. I think Schottenheimer showed he can run the ship well enough that probably isn't necessary. And now he gets to bring in his handpicked up and coming defensive coordinator, Christian Parker. And I don't know what Eberflus provided, off the field in terms of the former head coach experience, but the defensive coaching part of it that he was tasked with did not go maybe, very, very well. So I think that bringing in Christian Parker, a younger guy, more dynamic and, more like, Schottenheimer's the one who picked him to be on his coaching staff. I think that that's really an interesting setup, and I'm pretty excited to see how that works out. Speaking of the offensive staff, though, I think that the fact that they're now a year into managing George Pickens and then getting to, work with him and CeeDee Lamb, see how those ideas play out, get that time where Lamb was out and you got to, use Pickens in more and more ways. I think that there's, every chance that they're going to be even better at just deploying those guys and really getting the scheme up and running in year two of this offense. And, we'll see with Pickens. Obviously, he's playing on the franchise tag. Obviously things went well enough in Dallas last year to get him playing at, a level that should get him paid a lot more than that. And I would guess that, as a former second round pick, Pickens will make a lot more on this deal than I think he did the first 4 years of his career. Not a thought. Yeah, it's a significant amount more money. So, I would guess that has him motivated enough to be the dude he was last year. And hopefully as football fans, we just get to see that moving forward because he is just so much fun to watch. I mean, just his sideline acrobatics are just second to none. I think it's fair to say. I mean, it's just pretty rare to see a guy with that length who is just that good at adjusting to the ball. So, should be a blast there. They got a good quarterback thrown to him in Dak Prescott, who is, outstanding operator down to down, has those weird moments where he just will throw the ball right to a safety. He seems a little overly fond of pushing it up the seam at times and puts guys in a bad spot. But we're talking about like a throw or two here or there. I mean, overall, Dak is just such a good player. I just note those moments because they're in the context of how well he's typically playing. There are snaps where it's just like, what on earth happened on that one? So, but setting those aside, I think that he's got a shot to. Honestly, I think that if Dak's going to win an MVP in his career, I think this would be the year, and he's got the tools around him to do it. He'd have the narrative, all that sort of stuff. And he's got, just so many good weapons. Jake Ferguson is a really solid player at tight end for them to kind of round out that pass catching group. You've got some depth players at tight end as well who have shown themselves to be capable enough to contribute. Ryan Florney adds some depth as a pass catcher. And then, Javonte Williams, I guess he has to prove it again, but it's several years since that major knee injury that derailed his career to a certain degree in Denver. And, he seems to be back and have really found his groove as an NFL back. And, hey, who knows? Maybe that's in his past. And, he's going to just continue to have success carrying the load for the Cowboys. He certainly fit in, extremely well for them last year. That would be my one big question about this team is if he did get hurt, kind of, what are you going to get from Malik Davis, Jaden Blue in terms of having that top offense, right? But, could say that about a lot of teams. I mean, shoot, the Bengals, if they lose Chase Brown, they're not going to have nearly as much juice at the running back position, right? So, the one big difference I would say though between this Dallas offense and the Cincinnati offense is I do think there's more star power on this the team that wears the star on their helmet on their offensive line. Tyler Smith to me is just as good a combination of power and movement ability as you're going to find at guard in the NFL these days. I think he's just absolutely outstanding as a player. Like. They talk some about him moving as a tackle if Tyler Guyton's down, which, but, at the end of the day, you can have this guy at guard. I mean, there's a reason they talk about him that way because he does have the talent to play tackle as well, but he's just such a difference maker for them. And then Tyler Booker coming off a really strong rookie season. Hopefully he, takes another step going into year two, could be, the best guard tandem in the league, no question. And then you've got a guy who's been super steady for them at center and Cooper Bebe, really since he won the job back in 2024 now. I think he's, 2024, entering his third season here as a third round pick. And then, Terrence Steele, when he's healthy, and that's been a roller coaster for him throughout his career, I think he's a pretty steady player at right tackle. So, big question is if Tyler Guyton's healthy for them at left tackle. And that is a big question because, they drafted Drew Shelton in the fourth round this year, but they don't have anybody who clearly sticks out as being able to kick out and handle themselves at tackle. They don't have very much identifiable depth on the offensive line, period. So if that starting five can be out there for them, I think it could be really, really good. But if they do have an injury along the way, it might be a difficult ship to right in terms of figuring out that situation. Now, the offense hasn't been the problem, of course, right? So the question becomes what's this defense going to be? And, as opposed to the Bengals situation, I feel a lot more confident that the Cowboys are going to be, I think their floor, if Quinnen Williams is healthy, as being an average-ish defense, and I think that they've got a ceiling, maybe not as an elite defense, just because we'll talk about a few potential holes, but I think as a plus defense that could be in the top half of the league in terms of defenses when it's all said and done. The biggest reason for that is I've got a lot more confidence in what they're going to get from Quinnen Williams. He's already shown it. He was a midseason trade acquisition last year and, started to turn the defense around from the time he got there and, had some injury issues, but, Quinnen Williams has just been an unbelievable player really since he got in the league. Think back to his draft profile pictures with the braces, if I'm recalling that correctly, but just, developed pretty darn quickly in the NFL, was always you could see it from day one. I feel like this guy has the traits to be a big time three tech in the NFL. And he's just developed into exactly that. And, circumstances have to line up to win defensive player of the year, but he's the type of player where I think he's got it in him to do that. To me, he compares very, strongly to Jeffrey Simmons down there in Tennessee, who's kind of another one of these prototypical guys at the three tech position, 6'4", 6'5", 310, 315, long arms, slippery. You can throw a lot of guys under that description. But yeah, Quinnen's as good as any of them. And when you've got a guy like that anchoring your defense, that's just an unbelievable starting point. I think that around him, I like the acquisitions of Atita Ogbonia and Jonathan Bullard as free agents. Ogbonia has been with the Chargers, has been solid run defender for them under Jim Harbaugh here. Jonathan Bullard's been around the league a little bit more, adds another body for depth in terms of a big body on the defensive line. So I think that's a positive. They add LT Overton in the fourth round just to, give them one more body there. And then they've got Kenny Clark as a guy who's got some penetration ability left to play next to Quinnen. So, in terms of playing, looks like, it could be, likely to be a three-man line under Christian Parker. At least that's how they got it laid out on our lads. But, that would kind of give them a, solid rotation there. And then the edges are where they're going to need, some bets to work out, I think, for this defense to be all it can be. Rashawn Gary, just has not been the same player as he was pre-injury in Green Bay. Now we'll see if change of scenery in Dallas changes things up. At the very least, he's a rotational player who, should be able to take snaps. And then you've got Donovan Ezerico, last year's second round pick, and then this year's first round pick, Malachi Lawrence. And I can speak to Ezerico a little bit more, having watched his NFL film. And, there's a lot of optimism about him down in Dallas, and I think that's warranted. I think that Ezerico has really intriguing just combination of agility, short area quickness, and then for a guy as small as he is, and what does he check in at? Let me see the math. I think it's like 6'1", 240, 6'2", 255. So a little bigger than I would have guessed. 250 makes more sense actually now I say it, but not the longest guy in the world by any means, but I think he plays with good strength, good leverage, gets himself in good body position. So that's not like a huge factor. So if he can figure out a way to finish more consistently and, rack up sacks and everything like that, I think that he'll start to get a lot more national acclaim, because there are times where I felt like the quickness and everything like that wasn't quite translating to production, but the beginnings are there. And hey, from the quickness, you can hopefully coach the finishing a lot easier than, hey, if the guy's not quick, then that's going to be tough to develop once he's in the NFL. So I'm excited to see what they get from him as Rico this year. Another guy I'm really excited to see is DeMarvion Overshawn, who I was really enjoying watching 2 years ago before the devastating knee injury, and a lot to come back from. But hopefully, if he gets back to the explosive player he was, he was really a force in the middle of that defense, and he'll have a very steady running mate next to him in D. Winters, who is not the man. San Francisco just rolled out so many impactful off-ball linebackers, from Fred Warner to Dre Greenlaw to Azim Al-Shair. It was kind of wild to see Winters step in there and only be steady, right? Which is obviously usually a positive for somebody. But the Cowboys bring him in, should just provide a better presence in the middle of that defense than the options they brought in last year were just kind of doomed to fail, I think, from the beginning, especially Kenneth Murray, who's just kind of teased so many teams in this league at this point with his, obviously former first round pick, who just never quite had it click for him. I think that you can be good there. And then Jay Sean Barham, who they drafted in the third round, that's a range where you can certainly find an impact off the ball linebacker. And, we'll see how Overshown's looking heading into this year. But if something happens with his recovery, then you've got at least draft capital at a position where, hey, be interesting to see what a dice roll looks like with a third round pick. The back end of the defense, again, like it should be a lot steadier. And, we talk about the spine of the defense. So let's talk about two additions together in veteran safety Jalen Thompson, and then adding safety Caleb Downs, the prospect out of Ohio State, with the 11th overall pick. Downs is kind of profiling as if he'll play the star position for them. Jalen Thompson can also play down. He's played a ton of roles with Arizona, so they could see some versatility in how Christian Parker uses those guys. Thompson is just another really steady player. I think similar to D. Winters, Thompson has played a ton of snaps for Arizona over a number of years, so his availability is outstanding. He's seen a lot as a veteran player. You're going to be pairing him with Malik Hooker in the back end, probably, if Caleb Downs is a star. So you're talking about a Dallas team that might not have like an all-pro type, elite physical guy at the safety position, but Malik Hooker and Jalen Thompson have played a ton of football between them, and are both steady players who are not guys who are getting you beat out there. So I think that you've got those guys, and if Caleb Downs can be an impact player in the middle of this defense, man, the idea of like getting steadier with D. Winters, getting steadier with Jalen Thompson, and then adding like a big time impact player, if that's what Caleb Downs turns out to be in the slot, it's a pretty exciting group to get together. And I guess that leaves us with the outside cornerback position, which, as I say that, it reminds me a little bit of talking about the team that Michael Parsons, who formerly of the Dallas Cowboys, of course, was traded to in the Green Bay Packers, and kind of how that defense was structured, of late these past few years once Jair Alexander was hurt. Now the Cowboys do have what I'm alluding to there is just not having an outside corner with a defense that has a lot of other players. Now, Deron Bland, I think, has a lot more cachet to be called a legit starting outside cornerback than some of the guys on the Packers did at times. But Bland is an interesting, player to look at. He's had a lot of injuries. We'll see what they get out of him, but I don't think it's not a surefire guaranteed thing that he's going to be an outstanding player for you. And then they drafted Devin Moore in the fourth round. They had Siobhan Ravel in the building, who was coming off an ACL tear going into his rookie year, maybe progresses more going into this year. And then they signed Kobe Durant, who was just was a starter for the Rams or played a lot of snaps for the Rams at the least, but kind of in that rotation where the Rams decided to make big time upgrades at that outside corner spot. So, I don't think Kobe Durant's terrible, and at least he's someone if these younger guys don't work out. But just not the same conviction at that outside corner as you do for some of these other positions on the defense. So we'll have to see how it all comes together. But even with that noted concern where, Deron Bland is, not an overwhelming stud as your number one corner, and then the number two position is very much up in the air. Those are, they'll have to overcome that to some degree. But there's a lot you can do defensively to make up for it, is if you've got a good spine in your defense and the defensive line can get after people led by Quinnen Williams. There's definitely ways you can help those outside corners if that does prove to be a problem. So I think there's enough here that, this could be a pretty darn good group. And as I say, it's tough to imagine a defense that if Quinnen Williams is humming for them and there's something of a supporting cast, it's hard to think of them not being, kind of middle of the league. So as I say, we'll see how it all comes together, but I think that big things could be ahead for the Cowboys this year. Now, like it's the NFL, and anything can happen to any team, but man, I think you got a lot coming together here, and the chance to be, a very good team on both sides of the ball. Especially, Christian Parker is a potential amplifier for that entire defense if he comes in and is able to kind of re-energize that unit and get them playing at a higher level as a group. So, be fun to see it all shake out here. Going to call it for today. Hey, a little bit less time than some of these other 4-team previews. Love to keep it to an hour at some point, but man, I get talking football and just brain keeps worrying. So fun to talk through it all though, and start getting ready. Getting closer and closer to June here. So season coming up fast. So as always, subscribe, like the show, all that's great. Appreciate you checking out the Essential NFL podcast. Hope you learned a little bit more about how the league's stacking up for next year. And hope see you again next time.